The Bellari PA555 is a Class A tube preamp with 4 line level RCA inputs and 1 RCA out, and can be had for around $250 to $275 here in the US. If you'd like to connect the turntable, your turntable will have to have a built-in phono preamp, or you'll need an external phono preamp to connect between your turntable and the PA555. The included tube is a Ruby 12AX7 and takes about 10 minutes to warm up. I did all my listening after giving the tube about 30 minutes to warm up before every listening session. Let's look at the inside. Looking at the inside, we can see a simple and clean layout, all through-hole components. On the power section on the right, we can see a Fairchild MOSFET and a Texas Instrument CMOS inverter. On the left side, we see the traces for the inputs. More on that later. There's a 12-volt DC input for the supplied power adapter as well. Here's the diagram from Bellari, and on the front side we see input 1 on a 3.5mm jack, the input selector knob, the volume potentiometer, the power button, and finally a power LED. The power LED, just like on the Shit Lokius, is a little too bright for my taste. It shines at you across the room. Hopefully on future models they'll use dimmer LEDs. For my listening impressions, I'll remind you, this is only what I heard in my room with my speakers and my amps. Your experience may very well be the complete opposite, and I won't argue with you that that is the case. I compared the PA555 to my everyday preamp, which is a Junsong JA-1, which is also a Class A design, however transistor based. The JA-1 has stepped relay attenuation and is a dual mono design. I also compared the PA555 with the Douk Audio T8 Tube EQ and Pre. That unit uses a tube for buffer and not gain. My listening impressions is that the PA555 shines at presenting a deep and wide soundstage and a very holographic image. With the JA-1, I can usually perceive soundstage at about 3 to 3.5 feet outside of the edges of my speakers. The T8 does add some nice harmonics and a little extra spatial information in the center of the image, but doesn't do much to add to the soundstage. The PA555, on the other hand, adds about an extra foot of width to the edge of my speakers. I'm getting 4 to 4.5 feet outside of the speakers with this little guy right here. The depth gets a little bit deeper as well. Vocals shine in the mids, and the highs are bright but not shrill. You'll also get as much detail as you can at this price point. As for the bass, here we go in the opposite direction. The bass is best with the JA-1. More controlled and precise, the bass hits deeper and harder. The T8 comes in next with slightly less bass but a little more rumbly, and finally the PA555 with the least amount of bass and the least amount of control over that bass. In this image we can see that the bass decreases in the waveform. Maybe the decrease in bass is what's required to get those harmonics and imaging so beautiful. Now on to noise. I don't take measurements. I can only tell you what I hear. What I can't hear doesn't concern me. The JA-1 is the quietest of the pack. The T8 comes in next, slightly noisier, and the PA555 is the worst performer here. For daytime listening, this isn't a problem. If you're throwing a party and have a lot of people around and you're cranking it, it's a non-issue. But when you're winding down at the end of the night with a nice glass of wine or a drink, the JA-1 would definitely be my choice. The PA555 has this annoying tha-tha-tha-tha-tha kind of noise. It's very hard to ignore it once you hear it. And in quiet passages, it actually is very distracting. To backtrack on that input selector, I don't know if it's the traces for the inputs or the selector itself, but something isn't isolated properly. When I change the input on the PA555, I do get some sound bleeding over from one input to the other. I can hear it more when the volume pot is open more than about 30%. Here are some recordings of noise samples. I recorded the ambient room noise, the JA-1, the T8, and finally the PA555. I suggest listening with your headphones. A tiny bit of that noise would be coming from the IOTA VX PA3 power amps. Unfortunately, I don't have any 15-volt DC power supplies to see if that's what's causing the issue here with the noise. Or perhaps it could be the tube. On my next video, I'll be talking about what this sounds like with an upgraded tube and also with a tube dampener. I don't expect that to change the noise because the rhythm of the noise sounds to be electronic and not mechanical in nature. And when I tapped here on the chassis, I didn't get any change in that noise. And since I'm a DIY type of guy, I might spend 20 bucks and replace the 3 capacitors on the signal side with some audio node capacitors. I'll let you know how that turns out. Below I've left a link to 4 16-bit 44.1 tracks of Dream in Color by Ryan King. You have the original and 3 recordings going through the different sources, the PA555, the T8, and the JA-1. Let me know which one you prefer. So to conclude, my listening preference would be the JA-1 for any rap or electronic music, but I do prefer the PA555 for jazz, classical, or any live music. The soundstage that this little guy gives you and that holographic image is wonderful. I would pass on the T8 at this point unless there's a budget constraint, in which case the T8 is a great starter unit for somebody starting out with a modest budget. Alright guys, we'll see you in the next one.